twin brothers married twin sisters, but 1 year later, something strange happened. The Tennessee sun bled crimson onto the rolling hills, painting the Rivers ranch in hues of fire and shadow. Dust motes danced in the fading light, illuminated by the single porch lamp where Dillon Rivers sat, the rhythmic creak of the swing a counterpoint to the chirping crickets. He watched the shadows lengthen, his gaze fixed on the distant treeline, a familiar ache settling in his chest. Dillon, the elder twin by a mere 3 minutes, had always been the anchor, the steady hand on the tiller of their shared life. While Nolan, his brother, chased the thrill of the wind in his hair and the rumble of engines, Dillon found solace in the quiet predictability of the ranch. The smell of hay, the soft nickering of horses in the nearby stables, the comforting weight of responsibility, these were the constants that grounded him. But tonight, the familiar comfort felt hollow. The ranch, once a symbol of their shared dreams, now felt like a battleground. The weight of their burgeoning business, the horse riding and tourism center they'd poured their hearts and souls into, pressed down on him, suffocating the simple joys he'd once cherished. He missed the easy camaraderie he'd always shared with Nolan, the unspoken understanding that had been the bedrock of their lives. Now, silence hung heavy between them, thick with unspoken resentments and simmering frustrations. He thought of Sophia, his wife, her gentle smile, the quiet strength in her eyes. She was his anchor, his confidant, the one person who understood the burdens he carried. He knew she worried about him, about the growing rift between him and Nolan. He saw it in the way she'd hold his hand a little tighter, the way her gaze would linger on him a moment longer than usual. He closed his eyes, drawing a deep breath of the cool evening air, trying to inhale the peace he so desperately craved. He remembered a time, not so long ago, when the ranch had been a haven, a place of shared laughter and unspoken bonds. He and Nolan, inseparable since birth, had roamed these fields, their days filled with the simple pleasures of country life. They'd raced their horses across the open pastures, chased fireflies in the twilight, and shared secrets under a canopy of stars. Then came the Carson sisters, Sophia and Laura, twins like themselves, their lives uncannily mirroring their own. Their meeting, at the annual town festival, had felt like destiny. Nolan, ever the impulsive one, had been captivated by Laura's vibrant energy, her infectious laughter. Dillon, drawn to Sophia's quiet strength and steady presence, had found a kindred spirit. The double wedding, a year later, had been a celebration not just of love, but of the intertwining of two families, two sets of twins whose lives had merged in a way no one could have predicted. But the dream they'd built together, the ranch business that had blossomed under their combined efforts, had become a double-edged sword. The pressures of success, the constant demands on their time and energy, had slowly eroded the very foundations of their relationships. The easy camaraderie had been replaced by tense discussions, the shared laughter by strained silences. The unspoken understanding that had always been their strength had begun to unravel, leaving a chasm of resentment and frustration in its wake. The tension reached its breaking point during a particularly heated meeting about the ranch's expansion plans. Nolan, fueled by a restless ambition, pushed for aggressive growth, envisioning a sprawling resort that would draw visitors from far and wide. Dillon, ever cautious, argued for a more measured approach, warning against overextending their resources. "We can't afford to slow down now," Nolan insisted, his voice rising with each word. "We have momentum. We need to capitalize on it." Dillon slammed his hand on the table, the sound echoing in the tense silence. "Momentum isn't everything, Nolan. We need to be smart about this. We can't just throw money at every opportunity that comes along." Sophia, ever the peacemaker, tried to intervene. "Maybe we can find a compromise," she suggested, her voice calm but firm. "We can expand, but at a pace that's sustainable." Laura, usually brimming with enthusiasm, sat unusually quiet, her gaze fixed on the table. She felt the strain too, the growing divide between them all. She wanted the business to succeed, but not at the expense of their relationships. "Compromise means stagnation," Nolan countered, his frustration simmering just below the surface. "We need to be bold, take risks." "Risks can ruin us, Nolan," Dillon shot back, his patience wearing thin. We're not just playing with our livelihoods here. We're responsible for our families, for our employees. The argument escalated quickly, the words becoming sharper, the tone more accusatory. The unspoken resentments that had been simmering for weeks finally boiled over, spilling out in a torrent of accusations and recriminations. It wasn't just about the business anymore. It was about the late nights, the missed birthdays, the exhaustion that had become a constant companion. It was about the feeling that they were losing sight of the very reasons they had started this journey together. The meeting ended abruptly, with Nolan storming out, the slam of the door punctuating the heavy silence that followed. Dillon sat there for a long moment, his head in his hands, the weight of their fractured relationship pressing down on him. Sophia reached across the table, her hand covering his, her touch a silent offering of comfort. Later that night, as Dillon lay awake, staring at the ceiling, the echoes of their argument still ringing in his ears, he felt a knot of anxieties tighten in his chest. He knew he needed to talk to Nolan, to try and bridge the chasm that had opened between them. But the words wouldn't come. The unspoken understanding that had always been their strength had been replaced by a wall of silence, and he didn't know how to break it down. The following days were strained, the silence between Dillon and Nolan a palpable presence in every interaction. They avoided each other, their usual easy banter replaced by curt exchanges, the shared laughter gone. Sophia and Laura tried to mediate, to encourage communication, but their efforts were met with resistance. The twins, once inseparable, now seemed to be living in separate worlds, their shared dream fracturing under the weight of their unspoken resentments. The tension seeped into every aspect of their lives. Business decisions that had once been made effortlessly now required lengthy, awkward discussions. The ranch, once a haven, felt like a battleground. Even the simple pleasures they had once shared, the quiet evenings on the porch, the early morning horseback rides, were now tinged with a sense of unease. One afternoon, as Dillon worked alone in the stables, he found himself thinking back to their childhood and the countless hours they had spent together, their lives intertwined in an unbreakable way. He remembered the time Nolan had broken his arm falling out of a tree, and how Dillon had stayed by his side for days, refusing to leave him even for a moment. He remembered the time Dillon had gotten lost in the woods during a storm, and how Nolan, despite his fear, had tracked him down, bringing him home safe and sound. They had always been there for each other, through thick and thin, their bond unbreakable. What had happened to them? He closed his eyes, drawing a deep breath, trying to recapture the feeling of connection they had once shared. He knew he needed to fix this, to find a way back to his brother. But the words wouldn't come. The pride, the hurt, the unspoken resentment, it all stood between them like an insurmountable wall. Meanwhile, Sophia and Laura watched their husbands with growing concern. They knew the twins needed to find a way to reconcile, but they also knew that it had to come from them. They couldn't force it. All they could do was be there, to offer support, to remind them of the bond they shared. One evening, as Sophia sat beside Dillon on the porch swing, the silence broken only by the chirping crickets, she reached for his hand, her touch gentle but firm. "You and Nolan need to talk," she said softly. Dillon sighed, his gaze fixed on the distant hills. "I know," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "But I don't know how." Sophia squeezed his hand, her eyes meeting his. "Just start by listening," she said. Listening. Sometimes that's all it takes. Across town, Laura sat with Nolan in their living room, the silence between them equally heavy. She watched him pace restlessly, his frustration evident in every movement. "He just doesn't understand," Nolan muttered, his voice laced with anger. "He doesn't see the potential, the opportunities we have." Laura reached out, her hand gently resting on his arm. "Maybe he just needs time," she said softly. "Maybe he just needs to see things from your perspective." Nolan shook his head, his frustration bubbling to the surface. "He's always been like this, always holding back, always playing it safe. It's infuriating." Laura sighed, knowing there was no easy solution. The twins were at an impasse, their once unshakable bond threatened by the very dream they had built together. The next morning, the tension reached a fever pitch. A disagreement over a seemingly minor business decision escalated into a shouting match, the words harsh and accusatory. Dillon, his patience finally snapping, stormed out of the ranch office, slamming the door behind him. Nolan stood there for a long moment, his chest heaving, his anger simmering just below the surface. He grabbed his keys and headed for the stables, needing to escape the suffocating tension. As he saddled his horse, his mind raced, replaying the argument, the hurt and frustration churning inside him. He mounted the horse, digging his heels into its flanks, and galloped out into the open fields, the wind whipping through his hair, the speed a temporary distraction from the turmoil within. He rode hard, pushing the horse to its limits, needing to release the pent-up emotions that threatened to consume him. As Nolan rode, lost in his anger and frustration, he failed to notice the approaching storm. Dark clouds gathered overhead, the sky darkening ominously. The wind picked up, whipping the rain into a frenzy, obscuring his vision. He urged the horse onward, desperate to escape the storm, but the rain made the ground treacherous. The horse, startled by a sudden clap of thunder, reared up, throwing Nolan to the ground. He landed hard, his head hitting a rock. For a moment, everything went black. When he came to, he was disoriented, his head throbbing, his body aching. He tried to sit up, but a sharp pain shot through his ribs. He realized he was trapped, his leg pinned beneath the fallen horse. He called out for help, but his voice was swallowed by the wind and rain. He tried to move the horse, but it was too heavy. Panic began to set in. He was alone, injured, and the storm showed no signs of abating. Meanwhile, back at the ranch, Dillon felt a sudden, inexplicable wave of unease wash over him. It was the same feeling he'd always had whenever Nolan was in trouble, a primal connection that transcended words or distance. He tried to dismiss it, telling himself it was just his imagination, but the feeling persisted, growing stronger with each passing moment. He paced restlessly, his anxiety mounting. He knew he had to do something, but he didn't know what. He couldn't shake the feeling that Nolan was in danger. He grabbed his keys and headed for his truck, his heart pounding in his chest. As he drove, the rain came down in sheets, making the dirt roads treacherous. He gripped the steering wheel tightly, peering through the downpour, his fear growing with each mile. He reached the open fields where Nolan had ridden, his eyes scanning the landscape, searching for any sign of his brother. And then he saw it, the fallen horse, Nolan's limp form lying beneath it. He slammed on the brakes, jumping out of the truck before it had even come to a complete stop. He ran towards Nolan, his heart pounding in his chest, his fear turning to panic. He reached his brother's side, dropping to his knees, his voice trembling. "Nolan! Nolan, can you hear me?" Nolan groaned, his eyes fluttering open. He looked up at Dillon, his face pale, his voice weak. "Dillon." Relief washed over Dillon, so intense it almost brought him to his knees. He carefully assessed Nolan's injuries, realizing his leg was trapped. He tried to move the horse, but it was too heavy. He knew he needed help. He pulled out his phone, his hands shaking, and dialed 911. As he waited for the paramedics, he stayed by Nolan's side, talking to him, reassuring him, his voice calm despite the fears that gnawed at him. The argument, the tension, the resentment, it all faded away, replaced by the primal bond they had shared since birth. The paramedics arrived quickly, working efficiently to free Nolan's leg. As they loaded him onto a stretcher, Dillon looked at his brother, their eyes meeting in a moment of unspoken understanding. The storm raged around them, but inside, something had shifted. The wall of silence had crumbled, replaced by a renewed sense of connection. The near tragedy had brought them back to each other, reminding them of what truly mattered. Nolan's injuries, while serious, were not life-threatening. A broken leg, a few cracked ribs, and a mild concussion. He was lucky. As he lay in his hospital bed, Dillon by his side, the weight of their recent conflict pressed down on him. He had been so focused on his ambitions, on proving himself, that he had lost sight of what truly mattered. He had pushed his brother away, jeopardizing the very bond that had always been their strength. He looked at Dillon, the worry etched on his face, the concern in his eyes. He had been so blinded by his frustration that he hadn't seen the toll it was taking on Dillon, the strain of carrying the weight of their shared dream alone. "I'm sorry, Dillon," he said, his voice hoarse. "I've been a jerk." Dillon squeezed his hand, his expression softening. "It's okay, Nolan. We both have." The words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken emotions. They had both been so caught up in their struggles that they had forgotten how to be brothers. The accident had been a wake-up call, a stark reminder of how quickly things could change, how easily they could lose what they held most dear. The next few days were a blur of hospital visits, medical updates, and quiet conversations. Sophia and Laura were there too, their presence a constant source of comfort and support. They had witnessed the strain on their husbands, the growing rift between them, and they had waited patiently for them to find their way back to each other. As Nolan recovered, the conversations between the brothers deepened, the silence replaced by a renewed sense of openness and honesty. They talked about their frustrations, their fears, their dreams for the future. They acknowledged the mistakes they had made, the hurt they had caused, and the importance of finding a way to move forward together. One evening, as they sat together on the hospital balcony, watching the sunset paint the sky in hues of orange and purple, Dillon turned to Nolan, his expression serious. "We need to change things, Nolan," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "We can't keep going like this. We're burning ourselves out, and for what?" Nolan nodded, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "I know," he admitted. "I've been so focused on building the business, on making it successful, that I've forgotten why we started this in the first place." "We started it together," Dillon reminded him, his voice gentle. "And that's how we need to continue. We need to find a balance, a way to make this work without losing ourselves in the process." The conversation continued late into the night, the brothers finally confronting the issues that had been driving them apart. They talked about their different approaches to business, their strengths and weaknesses, and the importance of finding a way to complement each other, rather than compete. They talked about the need to prioritize their families, their relationships, and their well-being. By the time the first rays of dawn crept over the horizon, they had reached a new understanding. They had rediscovered the bond that had always been their strength, the unspoken connection that had guided them through their lives. They had found their way back to each other. Nolan's recovery was slow but steady. He returned to the ranch, but with a renewed perspective. The accident had changed him, had forced him to reevaluate his priorities. He was still ambitious, still driven, but his focus had shifted. He no longer saw success solely in terms of business growth. He saw it in the strength of his relationships, in the happiness of his family, and the simple joys of life on the ranch. The dynamic between the brothers changed. The tension dissipated, replaced by a renewed sense of respect and understanding. They learned to appreciate each other's strengths, to compromise when necessary, and to communicate openly and honestly. They realized that their differences, once a source of conflict, could be their greatest asset. Dillon, with his methodical approach and attention to detail, took on the role of managing the ranch's day-to-day operations, ensuring that everything ran smoothly and efficiently. Nolan, with his boundless energy and creative vision, focused on expanding their marketing reach, developing new programs and experiences that would attract visitors from far and wide. Sophia, with her organizational skills and financial acumen, continued to oversee the business side of things, ensuring that their growth was sustainable and responsible. Laura, with her infectious enthusiasm and knack for connecting with people, became the face of the ranch, welcoming guests, organizing events, and sharing their story with the world. The ranch flourished under their combined efforts, but this time, the success felt different. It wasn't about the numbers, the profits, the accolades. It was about the sense of community they had created, the joy they brought to others, the legacy they were building together. They had found a way to balance their ambition with their values, their dreams with their relationships. They also made time for themselves, for their families. They rediscovered the simple pleasures they had once taken for granted, the quiet evenings on the porch, the early morning horseback rides, the shared meals around the kitchen table. They learned to say no to opportunities that would stretch them too thin, to prioritize their well-being, to nurture the bonds that held them together. One warm summer evening, a year after Nolan's accident, the four of them sat together on the porch swing, watching the sunset paint the sky in hues of orange and pink. A gentle breeze rustled through the trees, carrying the scent of wildflowers and freshly cut hay. A comfortable silence settled between them, a silence that spoke volumes about the journey they had taken together. Sophia, her hand resting on her slightly rounded belly, smiled at Dillon. "I think it's time we told them," she said softly. Dillon nodded, his eyes twinkling with excitement. He reached for Nolan and Laura's hands, their fingers intertwining in a silent gesture of unity. "We're going to be parents," he announced, his voice filled with quiet joy. Laura gasped, her eyes widening in surprise. "You're kidding," she exclaimed, her voice filled with delight. She looked at Nolan, her excitement bubbling over. "We're going to be aunts and uncles." Nolan grinned, his eyes sparkling with happiness. He reached for Laura's hand, squeezing it gently. "And not just aunts and uncles," he said, his voice a little shaky with emotion. "We're going to be parents too." The news was met with laughter, tears, and joyful embraces. The twins, once divided by ambition and resentment, were now united by a shared joy, a new chapter in their intertwined lives. They had faced challenges, had overcome obstacles, had learned valuable lessons about the importance of family, forgiveness, and the true meaning of success. The ranch, once a symbol of their fractured dreams, had become a testament to their resilience, their love, and their unwavering bond. It was a place where their children would grow up, surrounded by family, by nature, by the legacy they had built together. As the stars began to twinkle in the darkening sky, they sat there in comfortable silence, their hearts filled with gratitude and anticipation. They had found their way back to each other, had rediscovered the magic of their shared dream, and were ready to embrace the future, together.